Hi everyone, and welcome to the Back 40 Feet, where we talk about suburban, urban, and patio gardening. Today I'm out here in the back 40 on my deck, getting ready to plant tomatoes. And I was thinking that now would be a good time to talk about different tomato types and what you're going to look for if you want to pick out a tomato variety. It can be pretty overwhelming when you can go to pick out a tomato plant or seeds to put in your garden if you didn't have a previous idea of what you wanted to have in there. So let's actually talk about different categories and types and phrases that you might see regarding tomato plants so that you can pick out the right plant for your space. The first thing that you're going to see is plants are going to be called either indeterminate or determinate plants. So basically vines versus a bush. And I know you don't usually think of a tomato plant as a vine, but it actually is. So when you're looking at those, let's start first with a bush type. So determinate tomatoes, and yes, sometimes you'll see them called a bush tomato or bush type, usually will stay within 4 feet. So they're a bit shorter, they're a bit shrubbier, and they work really well for container gardening. So if you have a patio that you would like to put your tomato plant on, a determinant or bush type tomato is a great option for you. One of the things with the determinant tomatoes, and again, they work really well in a small garden. And if you're using sort of those hoop tomato cages that you see at the department stores or the home centers, those work really good too for these tomato plants. But they also have a shorter harvest window. So you may be getting all of your tomatoes in a 2 or 3 week period instead of all season. Just to keep in mind. If you did that, it's fine, but if you're somebody that wants to have tomatoes all year round and the determinate type tomatoes work best for you, you may want to consider getting a couple of different varieties that have different harvest times, and I'll talk about that next. So then there's the indeterminate tomato plants. These are the ones that I prefer to use. They can grow up to 9 feet tall. I grow my tomato plants vertically on tomato ladders. So for me in a small garden, this actually works pretty well because I can still plant one tomato plant for every like 1.5, like by 1.5 foot section. But they do get quite tall. One advantage of indeterminate type tomatoes is that they have a continuous harvest. So once my tomatoes start coming in, I can usually get tomatoes all the way to about the first frost. So for me, that works really well to sort of space out my harvest, so I don't get overwhelmed and suddenly have to can a whole bunch of tomatoes all at once, which, well, I probably end up having to do anyways. But then the next thing you want to look at is the type of season. So sometimes you'll see tomatoes listed as early, late, mid-season. So these are really how long it takes those tomato plants to mature to have fruit. So, and again, it's going to really depend on what your climate is like. Here in New England, having a long season tomato is really, really challenging unless you use season extenders. And even still, it's really tough because you still need enough sunlight to grow those tomatoes. I would consider anything that when you're looking at the tags on the seeds or the plants that say 85 days, that's actually a long time. That's 3 months, and that's just not going to work here very well in this type of climate. But those would be sort of your long season. I've even seen some that say 90 to 100 days. The average season is really kind of around the 70s. So that's just your regular sort of mid-season here in New England. And then some of the earlier varieties will say 60 days. But something else to consider with those earlier varieties is that some of them are really designed for those a shorter season area that can thrive on a little less sunlight. So, you know, some of the folks that are living in like some more northern latitudes like Montana or Oregon. The other thing with the earlier tomatoes is that they can tolerate the cold a lot better. I think that there's a variety out there called the Beaver Lodge series. There's also another one called the Ultimate Tomatoes. And those are really designed for short, cold seasons. You'll get a smaller tomato. You will probably not get a tomato more than a 2-inch in diameter, but you still will have your own tomatoes. Another thing to consider when you're looking at tomatoes to grow is disease resistance. So heirloom tomatoes are just that. They're seeds that people have stored for a long period of time and keep growing, but some of them could potentially be susceptible to different type of diseases. So I don't know, probably about 10 years ago, I got blight from a tomato plant, and it's since has stayed in the soil. So any tomato plants that I plant, I have to make sure that it has a resistance to that type of blight, or I'm just going to lose my whole plant, which would just be a bummer. So if you've had any tomato diseases, you may then have to kind of going forward make sure that you have a resistant tomato. If you haven't had problems, or if you have a patio, which would unlikely be able to have a disease carry over to the next season, you really probably don't have to worry about disease resistance. But if you're planting in your garden consistently, especially also if it's in the same place every year, once you've had one disease, it could come back the next season, that the spores sort of live in the ground. So you'd want to make sure you pick varieties going forward that would be resistant. So those are kind of the growing considerations that you have to have. Now let's talk about your taste. What are you going to grow as types of tomatoes? So first it kind of goes to size and types. So the smallest kind are called cherry tomatoes, and you see them in the grocery store. They're usually less than 1 inch in diameter. Some of them can also be categorized by shape. So you may see them listed as grape tomato. So those are, instead of being round or oval or pear-shaped. You might also see ones that are listed as currant tomatoes. So those really are the size of like currant fruit. So you're talking about like less than 1/2 inch in diameter as well. So Campari tomatoes, also called cocktail tomatoes, are a little bit bigger than cherry tomatoes. So those are usually about 2.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter. And those work really good if you're not wanting to waste a lot of tomatoes, but you still want like a nice slicer for your sandwich or something like that. Some people call slicing tomatoes, or you'll also hear them called salad tomatoes or steak tomatoes. So these are those big, giant, juicy tomatoes that I live for. They can be, 4 or 5 inches in diameter, sometimes bigger. When you slice into them, you can really just see like pure tomato. These can be really quite large. Sometimes when you're looking at them, they'll tell you either the size that you should expect your fruit to get or how many pounds. So there's some tomatoes out there that are designed to even be 2-pound steak tomatoes. And lastly, there are your plum tomatoes, which you'll hear called either paste tomatoes, sauce tomatoes, Italian tomatoes. So these are really your oval tomatoes. And what is different about them is that they don't have a lot of seed or sort of that like gel that you see inside the tomatoes. They're really designed sort of as more fleshy tomatoes. So if you're trying to make tomato sauce or tomato juices, you're going to get a lot more in there. It's going to be a lot less liquid. They're really designed sort of in that way. You can certainly use any of the other tomatoes to make sauce or to cook with, and I do, but you do have to cook them down a little bit more, and you have to get more of the seeds out. So if you're kind of more looking for that sauce tomato, I would suggest getting a plum. I'm not going to really talk about storage tomatoes. They're just tomatoes, but they're really designed to have like sort of a long shelf life after you've harvested them. My tomatoes don't sit around that long, so I couldn't even give any advice as to what to buy in a storage tomato. And then again, going to that, it's all about your preference. It last leaves colors. So for me, I typically like my red tomato, but there are other colors out there. So pink or rose colored tomatoes are really common tomatoes for areas that are used to colder climates. So some of the tomatoes from like Russia, or some of the early tomatoes have a tendency to have a pink color. They still taste fine, but that they just seem, I think it's just what genetics it is, but it's a pink tomato. You'll see yellow or orange tomatoes, and what's interesting with those is they have a lot less acid to them. So if tomatoes don't agree with you, or you love tomatoes but they still kind of give you that little bit of heartburn, you may want to consider a yellow or an orange tomato. Sometimes they could even taste a little bit sweeter. For me personally, like one of my favorite tomatoes is Sungold cherry tomatoes. They are pure sugar and they are orange, and they really don't have a lot of acidity. I've seen white tomatoes out there too along those same lines, but I have yet to find one with a ton of flavor. The black tomatoes that are out there that are really high in antioxidants, those are also really common from some of the Russian strains, and they really are black tomatoes. Sometimes the flesh on the inside could be red, but the outside's black, and vice versa, and any variations therein. Again, I'm just not a big fan of slicing into a black fruit. It just doesn't seem right to me, but they are tasty. There's also green tomatoes that are out there that they're never going to get red, that when they're ripe, they are green. I have a hard time just knowing when they should be ripe and when to pick them. And then with all those color variations, sometimes you can get variations therein, that they could be a striped tomato. Some look like that they're tie-dyed, or sometimes just the shoulders of the top of the tomatoes might be different colors than the bottom. So there's a lot of different variations in there in terms of color. So that's kind of like your nuts and bolts from the start to end of picking out a tomato plant and what you should consider when you're trying to figure out what it is that you're going to grow. And pick something and get started. Thanks for watching.